Good morning, Life Church family. Happy Mother's Day. You know, it's a rare occasion that I ever direct a message or teaching based around a holiday. But I woke up with some thoughts this morning that seemed to be a continuance. I was on a Zoom meeting, I think a week ago, and the question was asked, is there one individual that has impacted your life that comes to mind more than anybody else that you can think of? And so I took a few moments and began to speak about my wife and the influence that she's been in my life. I want to read a scripture to you. Genesis chapter 2 at verse 24. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. I've marveled over the years, and it does take years, that when a man and a woman come together and become a couple, they bring influences into the marriage, and they impact one another to the degree that they seem to lose their individualism as a whole, and they become more like one another. And this morning as I woke, I was just thinking about this and how the various ways that my wife has impacted me. I think the family is very important to God. We talk about seeking first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and we talk about prioritizing our lives, God, family, church. And sometimes we can get those out of balance, and I just want to make some comments about this today. I want to talk about the influence of a spouse. I would hope that for the most part, the way that your spouse has influenced you or impacted your life are positive ways. That's not always the case. I've observed a lot of people, but I'm reflecting on today on the positive ways that our spouses affect our lives. When I got married at the age of 24, my wife was 22. She had surrendered her life, been in the church, so to speak, I think for maybe 4 or 5 years, not sure. But I'd only been in the church about a year and a half. And anyhow, the teachers that she had, the instructors that she had, the ministers that were involved in her life, and then the example of some of the individuals in her family really impacted her, and she had a level of consecration. Her level of consecration and devotion to God was greater than mine. I was faithful to the house of God. I was faithful to services, and I was loyal to my pastor, things like this. But in her personal life, she had a greater devotion. I can remember coming home from work early in our marriage, in the first year of our marriage, and opening the door, looking back and seeing her kneeled at our bedside with her Bible open and a handkerchief on the bed, and she was there. She'd been praying. She'd been reading the Word of God, and I didn't want to break in on that, and to some degree, it was a little embarrassing to me because I didn't have that kind of devotion. So I'd go stand in the kitchen, and I'd kind of wait until she knew that I was there, and she would come out of the bedroom. But for the early part of our married life, she would maintain this devotion. Now, we waited to have children for a little while, and so she was in the home. She did not work, and so I had the pleasure of coming home, and the house was always immaculate, and The laundry was done and the t-shirts in my drawer were right up to the top. I hardly ever got down 2 or 3 levels because she was such a homemaker. And she would have, meals ready and things like this. And so anyway, for the first, I think, 2 years of our marriage, that's kind of the way it was. And she tells now that when we first got married, she was impressed by others that she should not speak so much, but kind of hold her peace and not say things. And, so it was kind of this 2-year romance in the clouds. It was wonderful. Well, after a couple years, she wanted to do some things, get outside the house, and with her experience, she answered a job advertisement and went to work for a newspaper in Sunnyside, Washington. And she worked there for a couple of years doing advertising. This is before the computers and all that. Everything was done by hand. Anyhow, in the process of that, it was about her maintaining her identity and not completely losing her identity. But again, I look to this first portion of our marriage and her devotion and her consecration to God and the habits that she had already developed that would impact me in who I was and in my Christian walk. Let me move on to the next one. It seemed like all life was scheduled around church services. If I wasn't working, coming home, we were changing and dashing off to some kind of a church service. We were very involved in the work of the church. We taught Sunday school classes. We drove the Sunday school, one of the vans. We did that for 8 years. We'd go out and pick people up before church, drop them off after Sunday school, and then go back and get them again for night service, and then drop them back off. We worked every weekend, many, many hours, driving a Sunday school or the bus, the van, for the church to pick people up. And so we were committed in that way, and then we began to have children. And then we would try to somehow incorporate our children into all of this church work. I managed a couple of car wash gas stations for my grandfather for a while, actually just before we were married. And so early on, I would maintain those vans. We would detail them, we would buff them and wax them and clean them and gas them and have them all prepared. And so we were busy doing many things in service for the King, the work of God, and service in the church. And of course, we were loyal to our pastor and anything he would ask of us. And so we got very involved. And again, we became very involved in the work of the church. Now, in contrast, I have this voice in the back of my head. We're at a family barbecue, and I'm with cousins, and my grandmother's there. And near the end of that event, barbecue, get-together, Grandma would pack up her stuff and head toward the car because it was church night. It might be a Wednesday night. It might have been a Sunday night. But she was loyal to attending church services. And I remember hearing my cousins mock her and say, "Oh, Grandma, she thinks she has to be at the church every time the doors are open." Now, I wasn't living for God. I wasn't participating in any way in a church during this time in my life. And those words that they spoke, they marked me. And the way that they marked me, it became a part of my identity, in that when I did surrender to the Lord and start going to church, when they talked about, coming back for the night service, I remember thinking and responding to them, "You mean church 2 times in one day? Why do we need to do that?" And so I can remember how it was the comments that my cousins made about my grandmother's faithfulness that impacted who I was. And who I was who I brought into the marriage. And so where my wife was so devoted and, she wouldn't dare think about missing any kind of a meeting or a gathering, a Bible study, a church service, a prayer meeting, where I was like, hey, whoa, we went this morning. What is, no, it wasn't that bad. But again, this was a challenge of the, bringing two people together. And it was the positive way in which my spouse impacted who I was and then who I would become as I became more like her. Okay, so while we were dating, I would go and stay in her grandparents' home. Not too many times, but a few times. And now I'm talking about her family. She is a part of her family and what they were. I was a part of my family and what they had been. And so again, you're bringing these two families together, and hopefully the positives of each spouse would impact some of the negative points of the other spouse. And for me, there were areas that I lacked that she and her family impacted me, and I was thankful for how they impacted me. I remember staying at her grandparents' house out in Spanaway, Washington, one night, and to awake like at midnight and hear Grandma and Grandpa across the hallway in their bedroom praying, interceding for their family, for their kids, their grandkids. And I thought, I'd never heard anybody do that. I'd never been in a house where people got up in the middle of the night and prayed. And I never forgot, as I got up that morning, they said it was time for breakfast. And so as I walked down the hallway, I glanced into Grandma and Grandpa's bedroom, and up on one entire wall were picture frames. They were pictures of all the family. It's an image I never want to leave my mind and what I saw. I would go into the breakfast table and they would brag about their, biscuits and gravy because they were from the South and out of Oklahoma. And so they were going to introduce me to all of this. And we would sit down at the kitchen table in a crude kitchen, and all of a sudden, Grandpa Goins would clear his throat. Let's pray. And he would begin to pray. And it was like a church service. What I mean by that was the presence of God would come into that kitchen as we prayed for those biscuits and gravy. I'd never seen that in all of my life. And so as I observed the family and went camping with them, and Grandpa would bring out his guitar and start singing songs, gospel songs, and we'd sing together. And again, we'd feel the presence of God, and sometimes we might end up even praying for somebody there at the fireside. These were things in her heritage and in her family that she was bringing now into our marriage, and that would live on and impact who I was to become. Now, it didn't start that way. And so today, I have to tell you, I'm very, very thankful for how my spouse has impacted my life, and now our children's lives, and in time, and in our grandchildren's lives. The heritage that she brings and the lifestyle that she was living has impacted me more than anybody now at this point in my life, at 62 years old, than I can remember. Anybody in my life. Now, my wife was a giving person. And it was like, are you sure? I didn't come from a situation like that. And there were individuals in my family that could be very possessive and probably could be referred to as a little bit selfish at times, a little self-centered. And so again, I'm a product coming out of these households. Now, my parents did split up, my mom and dad, at a very young age. But still, I don't remember, because it was more of, we were always in a survival mode. Even when she remarried, and even I can remember the battles over child custody suits, and then, what do you call it? Money for the children. Anyhow, that my dad had to pay my mother for per each child since their divorce, child support. And I can remember just, again, waiting on that child support check because we were just trying to survive and, didn't have a lot of extra clothing or new shoes or anything. A lot of stuff would wear out. And you don't think about that, later on as a kid. That's no big deal. It doesn't bother you. But again, I don't remember seeing a lot of giving to anybody because we were probably more on the receiving end because we were always in need. And so as my wife and I came together, I observed how giving not only she was, but her family was. And they were just so lovey about it and always wanting to give. And my wife seemed like, I'm thinking, wait, you're giving away the farm here. Let's hold back a few things for ourselves. Well, I didn't realize it back then, but it was the struggle that was within me because of who I was as a product of where I had come from. She, on the other hand, was confused by that because her family always gave and continue to give. Now, this is a change that's come in my life that, again, I am so thankful for, I am appreciative of, and I love to give. I love to give. Now, sometimes she has to slow me down a little bit. But again, this is the impact that my spouse has made on me because she brought it into our relationship. I want to share a story about a young couple, but it starts not as a couple, it starts as a young lady. And she was single for a long time, and she was in the church, and she was a giver. Not only did she return her tithe and was always faithful with that and give offerings, but she was a big giver to foreign missions all the time. Every week she gave to foreign missions. And if you ever spoke her name, that was the first thing I thought about. The foreign missions giver, because that's what she did. Very kind person, very friendly person. Well, she met a guy, and I was counseling them. And I remember asking things about, are you on the same page about, do you want to have children? And what about you? Do you want to have children? These are important things to talk about going into a marriage. And I think I was going down a list of things from material that I had looked at, but I think I also came down on the topic of giving. This person is a very giving person and is, has been faithful in their tithes and offerings. Where do you stand on all that? Well, I think he may have obliged me for the sake of the meeting. But after they got married, all giving stopped. All giving. No tithe, no offering, no foreign missions, none. And I watched as this young lady was impacted by this young man and how it began to affect areas in their life. Well, the eventuality was as they moved away. And then I heard later on they were struggling in their marriage. It may not have attributed to those things, but all I can do is tell you what I saw. And so it's important. Those are things that are important to talk about, of course, when a couple goes into a marriage, because that spouse affected that woman in a very negative way. Back to my wife. Her dad had a manicured lawn. He had a garden that was like out of a garden book. And that hadn't been my experience growing up in the household I grew up with. My dad was that way, but I didn't grow up with him. And so we did good to pull any weeds around the house, around the lawn. And matter of fact, we had a backyard in a house that I lived in for years that was never more than weeds. If there was ever a lawn planted one time, it was soon overgrown with weeds. I can remember going out and splitting wood in the wintertime. There was a deck out back. We started a deck. We framed it out with 2x4s and we were going to put concrete in it. We never did all the years that I lived there. And so this was a household that I came from. And so when I came into a marriage where her father, man, he just kept the yard crisp and he kept everything, so-so. And she would look out at that lawn and look at me. Don't you want to go out and cut the grass? Don't you want to, And so again, now if you were to come to our house today, our lawn looks nice. There's flowers planted all around. Things are kept up for the most part. It is a farm. But again, I attribute this to, and I'm thankful for, the influence that my wife, my spouse, brought into our marriage and how it's affected us in our home. Okay. My wife, for the most part, has always had a clean house. Now, when we had kids, you can't have a clean house all the time. The kids just like to go into a clean room and go to the box and pull stuff out and string it all over the place. That's just what kids do. And so there was a season of our life when the kids were young where, things could be a mess. But as they got older and kept things in their room, my wife has always been one to have a clean house. I got to tell you, I didn't grow up that way, but I love it now. And I'm an early riser, so I go to bed early. And so there's times when she has stayed up for 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours, because she wants the house clean before she goes to bed. Again, this is an attribute that she brought into our marriage and into our home that I'm the beneficiary of. And so our home is always clean. And sadly, and we've talked about it recently, for the most part, or all the early years of my life, I never vacuumed. I never ran a vacuum. I hated the sound of the thing. And so there were areas that I did good to get the garbage can out on the right day. But in these latter years, I'm still trying to adjust. I'm still wanting her to influence and impact me. And so I've taken up vacuuming. Maybe not as much as she would like for me to, but I have. And so I'm trying to find one positive thing that I have contributed into the relationship besides saying, well, I'm the logical one. So anyhow, I'm so thankful that our home is maintained the way that it is because of her. And she brought that influence. Her family was very loving. When we first got married and we would go visit some family members, when it was time to go, oh my goodness, they were mushy. They were all huggy and kissy and, oh, I love you and love you. And I'm thinking, I never heard this stuff all my life. And we didn't hug. We just waved and got in the car. And so that was awkward for me. And so when they would come and hug me, I was like, okay. It wasn't real and it wasn't genuine for me. This was quite an adjustment, and for me it was a difficult adjustment. I may have told you that in my youth, that's just not what my parents did. And I only remember my dad telling me that he loved me one time. No, he also came out of a household. He came out of a household that the parents just didn't talk that way. And so he was a product of that, and he brought that into the relationship with my mother. And again, these are the things that we bring into a home, a family, a marital relationship, and hopefully the impact of the spouse brings those things that can bring a change for the good. And so I've become a more loving person. I can remember times early in my marriage, my wife would say, "I love you." And I'd say, "I know." It took a long time for me to say to my wife, "Oh, honey, I love you too." But I always felt like I was doing it, as a response. And so this was a difficult, and maybe still is at times, area in my life to communicate to my spouse those words. So, again, if your spouse can bring positive change into who you are, and they can, be thankful for it. Be thankful for it. You can talk to my wife sometime and ask her if there's anything that I brought into the relationship that helped her. My mind's not there. Okay. So again, the being more, not just emotional, but being more caring, and these things I felt like was a very positive thing. Okay. I remember in Sunnyside, Washington, I was running a route. I had sold a business that we had, kind of got it, actually a couple of businesses, got it narrowed down to one because we had answered the call to go to Sunnyside, Washington. And while we were in Sunnyside, Washington, I was running a route truck for products that we were selling. And in the winter hours when the sunlight is short, I can remember getting up while the kids were still in bed, asleep, getting in my truck and starting my route and coming home because I was driving so far, covering so much area, and the sun was coming down so early, coming home, and sometimes my wife had just put the kids to bed. I can't tell you how that grieved me during that time. I remember leaving the house one morning, and as I pulled out the driveway, beginning to pray and just break down and sob. I sobbed before God. I can't live like this. This has to change. It's interesting that it was a year later maybe that we answered the call to come to Puyallup, and there was a change in our lifestyle, that I would not continue in businesses that would pull me away from the house. And I would get to spend more time with my kids and with my family. We are going through a time right now. This shelter-in-place situation has got men, not at the office or not at a place of work, but at their home. Some of them working from home. But you're getting more time with your family, and your spouse is getting more time with you, and she's getting more time, more help with the kids because you're there. Now, I know there could very likely be a swing back in a lot of areas, but we could still see a paradigm shift that is so significant that you could still have more time with your family. But so you have a comparison right now. I'm hearing people comment in their reporting and various things saying, "Wow, I'm getting to know my kids again. And my wife is loving the fact I'm around the house." And so I want to tell you a brief story of a situation that happened in our family and in our home. The company that I worked for that was originally my grandfather's company was eventually sold to this large corporation. And where we started as 5 employees, we went to 40 employees just overnight. And the business made changes and things. Because of the change and because I had so much experience in the company, with all these changes, they wanted me to work so many hours because they needed me there, they said. And so again, here I was leaving the house very early in the morning, not making it home until very late at night, after dark. And my wife and I had moved into a trailer on an orchard with the agreement that we would be able to pay the rent if we could change the sprinkler pipes every day. They were sprinkler pipes in an orchard of 15 acres. And long sprinkler pipes. Anyway, there were many times that I would have to tell my wife, I'm not going to make it home before dark, honey. You're going to have to change those sprinklers. I don't know what to tell you. I keep trying to get away from here, but they're not letting me go. And my wife, I think, was 8 months pregnant. And so this was so grievous on me that literally one night as I left work, I felt like I was having a nervous breakdown. My wife reflected the other day. She said, when you came home, I could hear you screaming in the car. And that's how bad it had gotten. I was screaming out to God that you've got to make this change. You've got to do something for me. You've got to step in. You've got to do something. And I remember going to church on the next Sunday, it might have been the next day or two. And I came in and I just sat down like a zombie on that front pew. And I just sat there even at the end of service. And Brother Leslie came in and he sat down next to me. He said, son, you okay? I said, no. And I began to tell him about my situation. This was his advice to me. Son, nobody's going to care about you and your family the way they need to be cared for except you. You've got to draw the line. You've got to stand up and say something. I had been non-confrontive in my life. I was always somebody, again, when you come out of a home where there's verbal fighting, okay, and when it escalates to the place of somebody has to call the police, what it did for me, it caused me to turn inward. And so the person that I had become, I was very inward and non-confrontive. And so even though my boss and those on the job were taking advantage of me, and they could care less for my family, but I wasn't saying anything either, except for, I got to go home. I got these responsibilities. Anyway, I had to put my foot down. And so one day I did. I went in and I put my foot down and I said, I just want to know, how to make this change, this change, this change. Well, anyway, I lived through that scenario, but I decided I would never allow myself to be put into a situation where my job took me away from my family so much. My family needed me. And so if that's the case, I would change jobs. I would leave a situation rather than live in it for years. Because as when my kids were young, my job had a lot of demand on me and I had to do a lot of traveling. And I would come home, and I never forgot the time I came home and one of my girls, when I reached out, they turned the other way. And I thought, what was that all about? And my wife just looked at me and she said, I think it's something they don't even understand, but they're internalizing the fact that you are away so much that when you come home now, they're rejecting you. And they don't even know why. And so I want somebody to hear me. Your family are the most important people. God, family, the church. This brings me to another subject or area. My pastor sat me down one time, or we were driving in a car on a journey, and he began to tell me how he one day went to his children and apologized to them. I said, what for? What did you apologize for? He came from a generation that the church was God. In other words, you served the church service. You didn't miss anything. If you were in the ministry, you went to everything. And he told me how he would leave his wife and family at home and go and attend all these meetings. And it came to a point where the family, the kids said, you know, they may have not verbalized it at the time, but they showed it later on in their adult life. You put the church in front of us as your family. And when Brother Leslie saw that and realized that, he said he went and he apologized and he began to make adjustments in his life. I guess he was telling me this because I was young in the ministry, and there were times, it seemed like, you know, one of my kids would get sick just about the time there was a fellowship meeting, and so my wife would say, honey, why don't you just go? She knew it was important because that was the kind of pressure that was put upon an individual in the ministry. You attended everything. So I'd go and she'd stay home with the kids. But then again, because we had so many church activities, there was a constant pull, besides my job, besides these activities, to be home or to be away from my home. Now, today, I'm very conscious when the activities of the church reach a calendar level that they are pulling too much people from their families. You know, you may say, well, we go to church together as a family. Yeah, but you're sitting in a seat, in a pew, and you're spending a lot of time just observing, listening. The petition level is not there. I am thrilled to see what's taking place now with these home meetings, these home gatherings, even at this Zoom level where you can look at a screen and see 2 parents and 5 kids sitting in front of the couch and they're talking and they're participating and now they're having church at home. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to see families together in this scenario. Okay? Just wanted to share that. Some of you don't know, I served as the district prison chaplain for 5 years in the Washington District United Pentecostal Church. Because of my job that got me into different institutions, I visited prisons. It gave me a burden for them. I got involved in the ministry. I visited many prisons around the state. And my wife got involved with me, and we would travel and go to these prisons and minister. And then and I did that for 5 years. Then we got involved locally in the Yakima County Jail and in the Yakima Work Release Center, and I went out there for 2 years. She worked in the jail for 2 years with the ladies' ministries there, and we would make arrangements for our kids. And then, when you feel like, well, you're sacrificing, you're doing the work of God, and you do that. I don't know whether we calculated accurately how this might affect our kids. But I do remember when we came to the place where the girls were getting older and they needed us. And my wife was going weekends on into the jail and I would stay with the girls. But I remember having this conversation with her. I think either I was voted on to the youth committee for the district. And so I was on several committees, and then they asked me I was going to have to make a choice. And we did. We said, let's rather than try to repair all those who've lived the lives they want to and they're in jail because of the consequences of their choices, why don't we go to the other end of the spectrum? Why don't we start working with young people and try to help them before they would ever end up in a situation like this? So we did. We shifted our focus entirely, and our ministry began to be more youth-oriented, worked in the youth department, and also teaching Sunday school in the church, but then also involving our kids in those things. Now, we'd been involved at the mission downtown. We had done so many things in the way of outreach and things like that. And sometimes we had to leave our kids at home, but other times we could take them and did take them with us. We did take our kids to the mission. It was not a very family place or inviting place, but we wanted them there with us. And at the same time, it also gave them exposure to the real world. Okay? So we made a decision to make a shift in ministry at a very important time. Now I want to tell you about another shift. Later on in life, kids are raised, they're married, they're out of the home. My wife expresses interest in going to the hospital. She enters a program, a chaplaincy program, and becomes a hospital chaplain at Good Samaritan Hospital here in Puyallup. She went through all the education pieces and did a lot of the workshop, on-the-job training pieces. And what happened was it put her in a place of having to carry a pager. And the pager could go off many times in one night. And every time the pager went off, she got up, got dressed, drove to the hospital, helped with a situation. Sometimes it would keep her for hours. Sometimes it was much shorter than that. And she would come home, climb back into bed, and minutes later the pager would go off. And she'd get up, get dressed, go back to the hospital. I know that there were times she'd do that 3 times in a night. And it was difficult. It was hard on me. It was harder on her. But it was something she loved, and it was something she wanted to be loyal to and to help people that needed help. She said she couldn't stand the thought of somebody dying alone. And she said, you'd be surprised at the amount of people in a hospital who actually pass on with nobody around, no family members, nothing. So she would sit with people at times as they passed out of this life just so that they had somebody. She loves people. She cares for people. I know you know that about her. But when I turned 55, I remember looking down the road thinking, I'm only 15 years from 70. And we are living our life apart here quite a bit with her involvement at the hospital. And so we sat down and we had a discussion. And I said, honey, I'm 55. That makes her 53. In 15 years, I'm going to be 70. Do we want to live the latter years of our life this much apart? I know how involved you are at the hospital. I know how much you love it, and you have a ministry there. But I'm asking you to consider that. She did, and she made a decision. She left to work at the hospital so that her and I, in these latter years of our life, could spend as much time together and with our grandchildren, our families, as possible. And so I just want to reiterate how important family is. Even with all of our work in the kingdom, family has got to remain a priority. Okay? Family has got to remain a priority. Some of us are becoming tempered in our work situation right now. You're not choosing to stay home from work. You're getting to stay home and either be away from work or you're working from home. But you're getting time with your family, and you're realizing the strength that brings into your family, the security that it brings into your children's lives. And so this is something not to forget. This is something not to dismiss. Even if things get switched back around and they call you back to work and say, we got to make up for last time and we need you to work a longer week and longer days and things like this. Somewhere along the line, only you can be the one that draws the line. Only you can look out for your family the way that your family needs looking after. Let me bounce back around and just say on this Mother's Day 2020, I'm so thank you for my wife Delia, my spouse, and the person who has impacted me in my life more than anybody I know. God bless you. I pray that you have a wonderful day. In Jesus' name, amen.